So hello, it's now on the hour, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar on the Just Energy, Just Transition Finance. My name is Laura Williamson. I will be facilitating today's webinar. So welcome. We have a full hour and a half and hopefully time for a lot of your questions and interaction. We're on Zoom, so we have a few the usual housekeeping. Hopefully everybody is familiar. We don't have cameras for this particular session, so please do put your name and organization in the chat channel. It's an opportunity for people to see who's participating, an opportunity to network and have discussion on the sidelines. We will be taking questions. There is a question function. Please put your questions in the channel and we will do our best to get to those both during the panel discussion and the open Q&A at the end. We're going to have a brief introduction by Rabia Faruqi, who is the Executive Director of INETTT. For those of you who don't know, INETTT is a network of independent think tanks that are working on the energy transition, a very strong focus on research and policy advice done within a trusted dialogue space, spanning the regions of the world. We'll then have a presentation by Laura El Qatari, who is the project lead at INETTT, and she's going to be talking about the Just Transition Finance. And then we have a panel discussion. We have 4 panelists who I will introduce to you in just a bit. But that's going to be our session for today. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So please start thinking about those questions you'd like to ask and make sure you get them in the channel so that we can look at them and prepare answers for you, hopefully. So without further ado, Rabia, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and hi, everyone. Many thanks for joining us today for, I think, a very important discussion. I'm really pleased to welcome you on behalf of INETTT to the launch of our first policy brief, which is entitled Just Energy Transitions in Developing Countries, Experiences from JETP Initiatives. This publication is a milestone for our network because it's not only our first published work, but it's also a reflection of our growing secretariat and its capacity to support research, collaboration, knowledge sharing, and skills sharing. I think it also demonstrates that INETTT's role is sort of evolving and can contribute meaningfully to the global policy dialogue on energy transitions. I think, as we can all agree, the global energy transition is not just about emissions and targets and technologies, but probably most importantly, it's about people, economies, and the legacy to future generations. So the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, are one of the means of financing a just transition. And we also know that a one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work. So, and the reason for that is that we have historical, social, political, economic contexts of developing countries that greatly vary. And as a result, solutions must vary as well and be adapted to those differences. So this is why just energy transitions must consider the specific needs and constraints of different countries, sectors, communities, and they should also consider the existing inequalities, the challenges such as energy access, the priorities that countries have in terms of economic development or industrial growth, and obviously also the legacies of past injustices. So in that sense, business, governments, and local community can all play a vital role in shaping what just transitions look like in practice. So obviously, this brief is a starting point. We hope it will spark meaningful conversations, but also further research, and most importantly, better policy outcome. INETTT is committed to continuing this work and deepening the global conversation around just transitions that are inclusive, equitable, and achievable. So thank you again for being here today. Thank you to Laura Al-Khateeri for leading this work. Thank you for the team for their support. And of course, thank you to the INETTT members for their valuable contribution to this work. I'm very excited about the discussion today and the insights that our panel and participants will bring to the table. Thank you again, and Laura, the floor is yours again.
Thank you, Rabia. A definite 150% support for the fact of people being at the center, right? Energy is not just a thing, it is a means to an end. And I think the focus, at least coming from the renewable energy perspective, we've been bad about, not bad, but the focus has been so much on setting up the supply that we've forgotten the other part of the equation, which is the demand and what that supply is meeting. So these discussions where we're really shifting the focus to a more systemic, holistic approach is very encouraging, and hopefully will build the necessary momentum. So without further ado, we'd like to pass the floor to Laura, the other Laura, in this event. As I mentioned, she is the project lead at INETTT, an energy economist working on energy, renewable energy, and sustainable development. So the floor is yours, Laura, please. Tell us all about just transition finance and this interesting briefing note that INETTT has produced.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for the kind introduction. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Great. So I'm going to present our key findings from our brief. We're very excited that it's being launched today. What we want to talk today about is why think about just transitions, the dimension of just transitions, the role of transition finance, and then a few thoughts about just energy transition partnerships, opportunities and challenges, and some conclusions. So let's start by talking about why we should think about just transitions. Climate change poses a profound, though often abstract, threat to the socioeconomic fabric of nations. For some people, it's a very concrete threat, but for many, it is fairly it's less tangible than the immediate fears of the impact of transition policies, such as job losses, poverty, reduced energy and land access, which are tangible and can significantly delay climate action. There's also the risk of replicating past injustices. And if we think, for example, of the histories of mining industries, of fossil fuel industries, etc., we can argue that a transition that mirrors these historical injustices, both within countries and between regions, risks eroding public trust in governments, legal systems, and broader climate efforts. And then there is a real need for a fair and inclusive transition from a social and economic point of view. A just transition must ensure fairness and inclusivity. It needs to protect vulnerable communities. It needs to avoid repeating the mistakes of past development models, and it needs to strengthen public trust in the shift to a low carbon future. Let's move on to the dimensions of just transitions. Obviously, just transitions can mean what justice means differs between whoever you ask. Just transitions, likewise, the definition isn't a universally agreed concept. But I think what we can agree on is that a just transition prioritizes sustainable development, poverty eradication, and decent work opportunities, while addressing potential disruptions caused by energy sector decarbonization. It also promotes equity, inclusiveness, and human rights, and ensures that historically disadvantaged groups such as women, youth, informal workers, and minorities, also indigenous peoples, benefit from the transition. Additionally, a just transition ties into broader themes like environmental justice, energy access, and economic transformation. That's something that has really come out from our interviews with different stakeholders in this. A just transition doesn't just exist within a vacuum. It's part of wider socioeconomic and resource-related themes within countries and in communities. And I've added a quote from the Climate Justice Alliance: a just transition is a principle, a process, and a practice. In the brief, we're differentiating between 3 dimensions of just transitions. The first dimension is risks, impacts, opportunities, and benefits, what you could consider distributional justice. And this is a lot about impacts on different communities, impacts on existing socioeconomic challenges from the transition, and then related issues such as land ownership and negative externalities. The second dimension is agency and accountability, what you could consider procedural justice. So is planning and decision-making inclusive? And what is the say of impacted communities? And third dimension is transformational systems change, what you could consider recognition justice and also restorative justice. This is a lot about learning from the mistakes of the past. The whole debate around new forms of resource exploitation versus a real change of the energy system. Again, that's something that has really come out of interviews. Many communities wish for a real change of our economic system and the way we relate to our planet's resources, as opposed to just replacing one industry by another one. Inclusion versus marginalization of dissent, human rights, grievance mechanisms, and compensation. I'm throwing here words at you, but each of these is a separate concept that deserves a whole separate research note. We cannot go into all the details, but the brief touches on them and explains why these concepts are important to consider in the context of a just transition. And then finally, who contributed most to climate change and who should pay for mitigation, especially in developing countries. Examples of these dimensions in practice, and in the brief, we go a lot more into the details of how these show in different countries. I've put some quotes here on the slides. I'm not going to read them all, but you're going to find quite some material from different countries in the brief, in which governments and communities write about what they consider a really just transition and how that looks in practice. So we're not making up new concepts here. We're drawing on something that governments across the globe have already recognized, and communities anyway. Moving on to the role of transition finance, and that is very closely linked also to the question of justice between countries and regions. But it's also a very pragmatic question, and that's transition finance really is a critical enabler for developing countries to decarbonize their economies. Climate and transition finance is essential to accelerate and secure energy transitions in these countries. And it can include many different sources of funding, including public, private, alternative sources, aimed at supporting climate mitigation and adaptation, but they can also be just transition linked. Financial support matters because many developing countries lack the resources to phase out and replace fossil fuel-based power generation and infrastructure. And I should add, not only power generation, but also energy systems across different sectors. That includes transport and housing and many others. Upgrading transmission and distribution networks, electrifying energy consumption across sectors, decarbonizing industries, and implement broader mitigation policies, and breaking the false choice between economic development and climate action. That's a very frequent argument of countries, their right for development versus their contribution to the mitigation of climate change. In reality, it should not be a choice between either or for these countries. And then the risk of insufficient finance, we do know without adequate funding, achieving timely, just, and effective energy sector decarbonization will simply not be possible. We're doing a case study in this brief looking at JETPs, which is a new form, a relatively new form of food funding, a funding mechanism for developing countries initiated in the last few years. The brief goes into more details and explains the background. I'm just summarizing here briefly some of the opportunities and advantages and some of the challenges. So on the opportunity side, it's a collaborative approach, governments, private sector, and institutions pooling finance. It means increased visibility for transition efforts in developing countries that have a JETP, for example, South Africa. It's a form of finance mobilization, and there's political benefits on both sides. There's also quite a lot of challenges which are interesting to dive into, because we obviously want to understand how to make such financing mechanisms better in the future, so more developing countries can benefit from them. And this includes that they are partly quite overhyped politically. Whatever finance you rally for these countries, they will only contribute a small share of what is really needed for the transition. They're loan-heavy packages. Many of them consist, a large portion of JETPs is constituted by commercial loans. Then there's concessional loans, making them very loan-heavy. And that's a problem for countries that are already heavily indebted. We can argue whether or not these packages actually address justice questions in countries, in the sense of the funds being used to mitigate the negative impacts of transition policies. And there is a risk of scapegoating as well. So if insufficient, if such funding mechanisms are hyped politically, but then end up being insufficient to really achieve any real change, would they be used to blame, to shift blame away from implementing agencies rather than helping build something positive? In conclusion, country ownership is critical. All of this reflects our interviews and our members' feedback. This one was, I think, the number one conclusion and takeaway from looking at JETPs. JETP financing mechanisms and generally transition finance must be country owned. It needs to respond to what the country needs, not only to what the funding side thinks the country needs. They require ambition on both sides. Funding alone, financing alone is not enough to drive the transition. We need more innovative financing structures. For example, pooled finance for comprehensive transition plans. And we need more transparency and accountability so that the public too can understand and see what the money is being used for. And with that, I thank you and I hand over back to Laura.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for that succinct overview and a really well way of sort of structuring the key findings of the report. I know that for one, I never really sort of understood the various pillars, the significance of the sort of the three pillars in the justice element of the JETP. So I found that really useful to help frame the approach. But don't go anywhere, Laura, because I have a question for you. I know your colleague's going to put a link to the paper in the channel, but you touched on a couple things at the very end about the loan-heavy packages, that sort of the disadvantage, the challenges, also the issue of country ownership. And I think that came out very clearly, not only in the policy brief, but in the discussions I've had with the panelists. So I'm going to ask you a provocative question, and I hope it doesn't put you on the spot too much, but based on what you've researched and the conversations you've had and JETPs to date, can we say that JETPs are truly partnerships. And when I say that, you know, are they really partnerships, or are they more sort of a rebranded traditional economics? Some might say colonial economics, if we really want to be provocative, that keep developing countries dependent on sort of the global north, both from a financing and or technology perspective?
I would argue they're certainly well intended. Practically looking at what countries need, you can also always argue some funding, some financing is better than no financing. However, I would agree with the fact that they are born out of a historical, political, socioeconomic context that rests very much and continues to rest on loan structures rather than grants and other forms of help. They raise the question of whether, more than, perhaps I would rephrase the question, moving away just from the partnership element, but to the question of, are they actually just? You know, do they result in some form of justice between partner countries that provide financing and countries that are partner countries and receive the financing? Thinking of the question of who are the countries who caused all this, who caused climate change, who are responsible for the majority of emissions, and who are the countries who are not, but who are paying a very, very high price due to climate change and the impact of climate change on them. I'm not sure whether I would answer that question with yes. I think it's definitely also a question for the panel to answer. I think we could work. It's a partnership in the making. I think the whole concept of JETPs is definitely a new financing mechanism that has a lot of potential that could be improved. I do think whether or not it is a partnership, it certainly is a financial partnership in some way. But I would like to hear a lot more about developing countries' views on how they see that.
So, and this touches on another point that you summarized in your last slide, sort of on the advantages and, you know, the challenges is, you know, sort of a question that popped into my mind is focusing on bankable projects that appeal to financiers rather than funding community-led initiatives, which then very much anchors that transition in the community and being led and informed by that. I mean, I think you addressed it in one of your slides that, you know, the country involvement is a really key aspect. Through your research, through your interviews with people, are you starting to see some of that evolution where there's I don't want to say a devolution, but sort of a migration from a top-down approach to one that is really being built more on national or maybe sub-national initiatives for the climate financing?
I think where it's very, very difficult for a pooled international financing mechanism like JETPs to effectively reach communities and to trickle down to communities. The way these financing mechanisms are structured are obviously based around whatever finance they contain. So if they're commercial or concessional loans, they will be based on bankability in some way and on the ability of the recipients to pay back with interest, which typically goes beyond the means of local communities. So this type of funding by its very nature appeals to probably larger scale projects, existing partnerships. And here, I guess it is also very much down to national governments to build infrastructure and institutions in such a way that such money can trickle down. But JETPs and international finance that is based on loans by very nature isn't very suitable for these smaller projects. You could, of course, always take such finance and say, we want to establish microfinance, for example. That would be a very interesting concept. I haven't personally seen this in any of the JETP initiatives that I have looked at. There are many, of course, but it would be interesting how this works. I do think that by adjusting the type of finance that is provided through such initiatives, for example, through grants, and possibly more philanthropic funding, this is money that potentially can benefit local communities much more and can go into projects such as mitigation of negative impacts, for example, through education, through training. And then there's the separate issue of any kind of source of money that is time limited, is difficult to invest into certain long-term needs. For example, if you need continued funding for education programs, I think we're at the very beginning of establishing how such funds can really help create change in developing countries, and that's why we need more of this sort of discussion.
Yeah, very good points. And I think also too, it builds on the discussion I think you and I had about, perhaps part of the funding mechanism needs to be at the, to countries who then implement rather than linked directly to projects in order to build in that more adaptive approach. Thank you, Laura. I'm now going to turn to our panelists. We have 4 panelists, so I'll ask you all, my panelists, to put on your cameras. Each brings a very different perspective. I'm going to give them a very quick introduction, and then we'll have them each do a little bit of commentary on the presentation they just heard. So we have here Nadia Comembrazzi from Polen, from Colombia. Raise your hand and wave. There she is, Nadia. Polen works on public policy and decision-making in Colombia to create a just and post-fossil-free future. Nadia herself works on affordable and clean energy for Colombians, not just from the climate aspect, but really energy as a prerequisite for better access to social services and providing economic opportunities. We have Jack, our male component here on the panel. I apologize that it is so female. Maybe I shouldn't apologize, but I feel like in order to be equitable, we should acknowledge the presence of women on this panel. Anyway, Jack is from Green Cape, South Africa. Green Cape works on economically viable green economy solutions. Jack leads the energy program and the climate financing programs, particularly driving economic empowerment and designing alternative solutions for delivery in underserved areas. We have Shravya Reddy from RAP. RAP is the Regulatory Assistance Project, where they work very closely using data and research really to help decision makers make informed decisions and policy making. She also works in RAP managing their ongoing projects in India, and in a side life or an additional life, works very much on climate change and low carbon development across Africa and emerging markets. And then last but not least, we have Diana Curel from Industrial. The all is very important, Industrial Global Union, which challenges the power of multinationals and negotiates with them to create economic and social models that put people at the center. And Diana herself heads up the energy section, which is the global efforts to support unions in navigating the challenges of the energy transition. So that was a very quick summary of our panelists. They, of course, have much more depth to them and much more experience. So we're going to put their LinkedIn profiles in the chat channel so that you can see who they are and connect with them and build on their knowledge and experience for your work. But let's now get back to reflections on what you heard, what you thought, what sort of precipitated thinking in Laura's presentation. And I think who I'm going to start with you, Jack, for 2 reasons. One is because being based in South Africa really being sort of a leader, if you will, in the JETP process, Very interested to hear not only your reflections on what Laura presented, but if you can bring in a little bit about the South African experience, about sort of what has worked, what hasn't, and how that reflects with what Laura has documented in the policy brief.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Maybe Laura, to you first, congratulations on a very well-written brief, and I think you've done an amazing job at succinctly explaining what is quite a complicated space. So yeah, great. Thank you so much for putting that together. So from my side, I think Laura has done so well at highlighting a couple of these key points, but there are a few aspects that I was interested to highlight. So I think first, South Africa is about 2 years into our JETP journey. We have about 2 years left, with the idea it ends in about 2027. And we've really experienced the ups and the downs of the JETP over the last 2 years. And I think the very big downside that we're seeing at the moment is less than 20% of the committed finance is actually being dispersed into projects. It's probably quite a bit below 20% actually. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. But for me, the two big ones are, as Laura highlighted, a big mismatch in the finance that was available. So South Africa's JETP and our implementation plan put a very big focus on justice. And we took very much a whole of society approach, really trying to address a lot of the structural inequalities in the South African landscape. But less than 1% of the 8.5 billion US dollars that was committed was ring-fenced for social and skills development in South Africa. So it's very hard to see a heavily justice-focused plan being implemented with financing where less than 1% of that finance is really focused on two key justice elements. On the other hand, what we saw was about 81% of the commitments being loan-focused and commercial rate loans or above commercial rate loans. A small portion being concessional. The next biggest was guarantees, so basically taking cheap money to make expensive money a little bit better. And then a very small portion, about 4 or 5%, being grant-focused. So that was one of the big mismatch areas. The second bit of mismatch that I thought would be worthwhile highlighting was the stage of financing that was available. So in South Africa, we are struggling to build a pipeline of investment-ready projects, and I think that's true for many developing countries. But what we saw from our financing that was available in the JETP was it was much later stage. So the majority of it started at a technical assistance point of view, and then a post-commercialization aspect. But there was a big gap in that project readiness support. So how do we go from a concept, from an idea, through into actual implementation? So there was that misalignment both in the type of financing, but also the stage of financing that was available. The next point that I wanted to highlight was the fact that we saw a lot of local private sector financiers in South Africa being left behind. So although they had been facilitating a lot of investments into similar areas that the JETP was going to focus on, they had very little participation in early stage design. There was a lot of competing for similar sectors and similar investments, rather than using the JETP as an additional investment mechanism to address where there were gaps in the local market. So I'll post in the chat in a second, but we track about 131 billion rands worth of annual investments in South Africa, and that's from source to end use in the green economy. And 90% of that is coming from local investors. So it was a bit of a misjudgment to leave out quite a significant portion of potential impact that could help to align and really drive the impact of the JETP in South Africa. The last point I wanted to highlight on the sort of challenges side was I think there's an opportunity for us to recalibrate or reconsider our expectations for these JETPs around the world. So there's often a trap, and I think South Africa fell into it, that with the expectation that these JETPs are going to solve all of our problems. And it was a silver bullet that's going to rectify decades and decades and decades of injustice in South Africa. But all that does is it allows us, as Laura said, to create a scapegoat when ultimately that fails. I think there's an opportunity to really think of these JETPs as funding mechanisms to pay for the marginal costs of a transition that wouldn't happen without it. So this is thinking about things like transmission infrastructure investments, investments in local manufacturing, investments in energy storage. All of these are aspects that wouldn't happen without international support, but there are the additional costs that a country like South Africa has to bear in order for us to transition. And I think if we can start thinking about that and really start thinking about justice on a national level and an international level, rather than an individual coal community level, we really have an opportunity to drive impact and change how these JETPs are focusing around the world. I want to end on one positive note, because there are a lot of positives in South Africa's JETP, but one of the most influential ones has been the institutional momentum that it's created. For the first time, we're seeing cross-governmental department collaborations. We're seeing the establishment of the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. We're seeing the new government of national unity for the first time in our democratic history, making strides towards collaboration. And that, for me, is one of the real big positive outcomes that we've seen from South Africa's JETP. We still have 2 years left. We're in the middle of, as many of the partners are, in the pinch of the geopolitical landscape. The US has now officially withdrawn from our JETP, taking quite a large portion of the funding out. And this highlights one last risk, is the JETPs and its participation and development is only as elastic as the voting public in those countries' appetite allows it to be. And we've seen now the voting appetite in the US has changed away from allowing international aid. And I think we'll likely see more and more of that as global pressures increase. So thinking through how developing countries respond in those spaces is going to be massively important going forward. So thank you so much for allowing me to participate. I'll post a couple of links in the chat to interesting pieces of work that I think could aid in the conversation.
Thank you, Jack. No, those are some really good points. You touched on one, actually, Nadia. You and I had spoken about it, about the supply chains and materials, and you know, Jack, what you had said that is about, you know, thinking about it as probably a mechanism, a supplemental mechanism, as a way of developing these larger infrastructure and transition mechanisms that are really needed to move the energy transition forward. Nadia, since I just referred to your name, your thoughts, what would you like to sort of pull out from what you've heard so far?
Thank you, Laura. Both Lauras, also a great job building this policy brief and putting all of this information in an easy to understand language, because it's really hard to read what is behind JETP. Well, Jack have explained a lot of what I wanted to say, but there is a point that I want to highlight, and is that many global South countries are more or less raw materials depositors. Like they are the ones providing raw materials or commodities to the rest of the world. And some of those are mainly exporting fossil fuels. And that's one of the cases that I want to highlight is Colombia, because we relied a lot on the export of coal and oil. And the thing behind that is that for us, the just energy transition is not only about domestic use, it's about a whole economic transformation, because when we stop exporting fossil fuels, then what's going to happen with the whole economy? And what happens behind that is when you look at the just energy transition roadmap from Colombia, there is a huge focus on industrialization. So it doesn't mean decarbonize the existing industry, it's part of it. But the most important part is that we have to build new industries. We have to create a new productive line value change locally that will create more economic activity, employment, and also approach all the injustices, these structural injustices around energy and mining systems that are already there. And I think the tricky part is that I haven't seen so far that a just energy transition partnership is focused on providing finance for a country to build an industry and be less reliant on the foreign countries. So that's hard because as a global South country, you need to create more economic activity to create value and sustain value in the country. But the funding is not for that. So the finance is not like created for that. So what happens there? And if you look at Colombia, like 2 years ago, they wanted to be the first Latin American country that had a JETP. But today, or the last COPs, it has been more focused on debt swap. So like reduce my debt, I will protect the Amazons or something else. But then as a country, I will have more fiscal space to fund my own transition. So coming to the point of the policy brief, something that I really like, Laura, was this lesson learned about the need for the country on transition finance. And I think that's a key point in the policy brief that needs to be part of it, because for all of the countries, it's not going to be about just changing the power matrix of the country or producing hydrogen to export. It's about creating more manufacture, more productivity, also at the community level. And this needs to be funded somehow. And that's the tricky part. And so if finance is not for that, then having the chance to have more fiscal space to build your own transition is also important. And yeah, those are some thoughts that we could discuss more later. But I just wanted to add that to what Jack already explained that is happening behind my JETP.
So it's interesting when you were talking about that sort of that tension between the need for economic and industrial development, which in its current state is already going to be, in most cases, energy intensive. It's going to require energy inputs. And how do you balance that with sort of the requirements of JETP? And I think that provides a nice leeway or lead into your work, Diana, about the people and the workers and this tension between workers' rights, workers' welfare, people's welfare, and the transition, and how do we make that happen in a way that places people at the center and touches on these aspects of justice that Laura outlined in her paper. So please, your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone. As Jack and Nadia already mentioned, there are many things that we already know about these challenges with the JETPs. But from my perspective, from the Global Union perspective, representing workers, we always say that it cannot be a real transition if it's not a just transition. But the thing is that when we talk about just, everyone is using the term of just transition, and we are using it in different ways. And for us, what has to be clear is that the just transition is that we need to make sure that the benefits and the cost of the transition are shared fairly. It's not possible that workers pay the cost of this transition, and is what we are facing in many cases. Also, about the participation, and the workers and communities, they need to have the real voice in the decision-making processes, because those are decisions that are affecting to them, and they need to be part of those decisions. And something that appears in the conclusions is about the country ownership of the JETPs. But I will say that it's not only the country ownership, it's also about the people's ownership and the workers' ownership of these JETPs. Because at the end of the day, something that is having an impact, a direct impact on them. And also that the just transition must respect the human and labor rights. Meaning with this that the human and labor rights have to be good jobs, have to be decent jobs with decent working conditions, with the protection, social protection for people during these processes. So this is what we all understand by the when we say the just transition. But if we talk about our union perspective and what is the main thing and the big concern is how this transition is going to be financed, because the money is coming as loans, is what we have already said, not as grants. And we are working with our affiliates, with the unions in the countries where the JETPs are implemented, and one of them and the most advanced is South Africa, and Jack was already mentioned all this. The thing is that they haven't been part from the beginning in all this process, and their opinions have not been taken into account. It's true that many positive things have been created after all this, and I think that these structures are really positive for the development of the new model of financing that is called now the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. But for us, what it's clear is that this is putting a lot of extra pressure on workers, and the governments are already struggling with other needs, no? And the funding on the skills training, the social protection, the job creation, and is still very small compared to investment, no, in the infrastructure. So if we really want this to be a just transition and this to be fair, for us we have to put people and workers first, creating quality jobs, because as someone, I think that it was Rabia at the beginning, mentioned that that green doesn't mean just. So creating these quality jobs is not just green projects. We need something else behind, and also to strengthen the rights and social protection for workers in order to as well to repair the damages that are from the past, and not repeat them, and learn the lesson. So this is what I will start to say. I think that also to refer what you mentioned and the question that Laura, you asked to the other Laura about the if the partnerships is a new way of rebranding the old colonization economics. I think that that's the way that the people is seeing all this.
Mm.
And I understand that there is a good intention behind, but the way that this will be done will make the big difference for them.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, good point.
So leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Lots of questions. I'm writing lots, and I see everybody else. So as soon as we're done with this short round, make sure you're ready to ask questions of each other. Shravya,
Okay.
Your perspective, and we've talked about workers, we've talked about the industrialization, we've really talked about the South African experience. You can bring in maybe a little bit also on from a regulatory perspective or a policy making perspective, what some of those challenges, or what, when you have that overlay with Laura's paper, what has jumped out at you?
Thanks, Laura. And thanks, everyone. And thanks to Agora and INETTT for convening this discussion. And I also would like to commend Laura for the brief, because it is a really important analysis of the JETP experience thus far, with a focus on the financial arrangements that do underpin it. I work in South Africa. Of course, I work with RAP that works globally, including in India, but a lot of my comments are going to be focused on South Africa's experience with the JETP. And there's a lot of room for criticism. There's a lot of things that could and should be done differently. But my sort of summary of the question you asked about the policy and regulatory elements is that actually in the time that South Africa had, firstly, as the first country to, be part of a JETP, to really be the pioneer of this type of new partnership, and recognizing the urgency of the climate crisis, the need to act fairly rapidly. People are hungry here to see the investments hit the ground. There's energy crisis here in terms of an energy shortage, and the JETPs, at least in part, meant to ameliorate some of those challenges. I think in that broader context, the policy and regulatory enablers and the environment that was created in South Africa for the JETP were a good beginning. That doesn't mean it's perfect. And of course, structurally, the biggest flaw is a design flaw. It's not so much a policy, I guess you could call it a policy flaw, but it's really the design flaw in the financial structuring, which is all the others have already said. If grant finance is such a tiny fraction of this overall package, then how just is it? In South Africa, the grant finance is only 4%, guarantees another 15%, and loans about 81%. And if the JETP is meant to be fundamentally different from other climate finance vehicles, then this type of structuring does not reflect that shift. There should be more grant money, there should be more guarantees, even though that's still a complicated mechanism. And there should be less loans in terms of, especially recognizing the debt servicing burden that these countries already have. I do want to quickly reflect on South Africa's experience with the JETP, using the very helpful framework that Laura has used in her paper, with using that lens of the 3 just transition pillars. I do think it's a very useful analytical framework for evaluating how JETPs are doing. And I think when I look at South Africa's work so far, I think we all agree that there are mixed results. But I'll actually go pillar by pillar. So distributional justice. In South Africa, there is a recognition of the inequitable distribution of past benefits and the burden of the transition, and so much so that one of the 6 portfolios of the JETP is specifically for the province of Mpumalanga, which is the coal-heavy province. There's also a portfolio just for municipalities, which are critical but undercapacitated and under-resourced actors in this transition. So those are some positive elements of recognizing the distributional justice component of this. But of course, the downside is it's unclear whether the implementation and rollout has actually aided the communities that need to benefit the most. And another element of distributional justice that is sort of missing here, or has been called out as a big gap, is a focus on the affordability of power. The second element, procedural justice. Again, there are some pros. One can always ask for more stakeholder consultation and more meaningful consultation. But there has actually been a fair amount of stakeholder consultations. The PCC engaged in a lot of that in 2023, and they continue to have some ongoing consultations. There is a fair amount of reporting, analysis, access to information, PCC reports, Just Energy, transition.co.za. There's a publication of a JET grants register. So there is a flow of information, but at the same time, again, as Jack mentioned, it's been fairly opaque to see where these financial flows are lagging behind, what's hampering the release of the funding. And another element that is lacking is the monitoring, evaluation, learning initiatives. What is really happening on the ground, such as, for instance, the training initiative, the training facility at Komati. We hear about these types of initiatives, but truly, what are the results from there? And even when there are assessments, they are not independent third-party assessments, and we need more of those credible and honest appraisals. And third, the element of restorative and recognition justice. I do think this is the weakest element in South Africa's JETP. There are provisions for rehabilitation and restoration of mining lands post-closure, reskilling of coal workers, temporary income support, placement support, enterprise development. This is all mentioned in the JETP IP. But again, the evidence on the ground suggests that this has not been delivered as anticipated. For instance, with the shutdown of Komati, the actual new jobs generated were a much smaller fraction than the ones planned. And yeah, it really does seem that instead of restoration to a situation without harm, the local community has been left worse off. But overall, on the balance, I do want to say that JETPs are useful and important mechanisms. They should be supported. They do bring additional finance. As Laura said, something is better than nothing. They are additive. They are catalytic, which is the intention. And again, we can't expect one mechanism, one instrument to be all-encompassing. No single financing mechanism can fund the entire just energy transition, and no one instrument can meet financial, social, economic, technological, environmental needs.
Can't
Quickly,
have the silver bullet.
yes, quickly, and I'm happy to expand on this later, but again, drawing on some of my own experience and the experience of colleagues, individuals, and organizations that are actually doing this work on the ground, there's a few learnings we're getting from the work that's actually happening. And this probably ties closest to the human rights element that we've also learned about in the brief. But we really do need to put the community at the center of it. Starting with actually establishing a shared understanding of what just transition even means. Our work has shown when we've gone out into the communities that everybody has a different understanding of what just transition means for them, but we need to establish a clear expectation within each community that's partnering in an initiative about what the just transition is and what it isn't. I mean, for instance, there was work done in a coal mining community in South Africa where some of the community members really thought that the just transition for them meant that everybody's going to be given, free parcels of land. And that's just not the case. And then when you disappoint the community and there's, mismatched expectations, it really does get in the way of that kind of community partnership spirit. Everyone on this call probably has a different understanding of just transition definitionally. And I think we need to do better to work with our partners and counterparts on that.
Make that clear, yeah.
I'll be very quick, but
Please.
again, in terms of the engagement, I think the engagement shouldn't just be to inform, it should be to empower. We hear a lot of terms like community-led, but the truth is, again, what we're finding on the ground is that some of these initiatives are delivered, say, in English, but English is the third or fourth language of these communities. And when you actually scratch the surface, you find that a lot of them simply don't understand what it is that they've signed up for. So if there are forms to be reviewed or contracts to be signed, and prior informed consent, really we need to start working with the communities in the language that they are comfortable with so that they understand their rights and obligations and benefits under any such program. And finally, one last thing that I think tends to be a little bit of a blind spot is we talk a lot about the financial assistance component of JETPs. But JETPs are also meant to include technical assistance and actually some technology transfer, because if JETPs are meant to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, Articles 9 and 10 in particular, then the just transition whole framework is meant to represent that. And one of the blind spots, one of the areas that just hasn't developed as much is the technical assistance bit. There are some small grants for that. But by and large, I think this is an area in the future to look at where there can be some augmentation, and maybe we can actually have some true technology transfer from the global north to the global south. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Shravya. Lots of good points there, and I was like, oh, I'm going to ask Jack that question, building on that, and Nadia and Diana. So I do have some questions for you. Just to the audience, please make sure you put your questions in the question. I see that Jack has been very productive and has answered a couple of the questions there. But if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the question channel, and I'll make sure that they get to the panelists that you would like to ask the question of. Sort of building on what Shravya said, Diana, and also building on this sense of the adaptability and really making sure that people are at the center. What kind of specific mechanisms do you think would allow trade unions to participate meaningfully in the JETP governance structures? You know, ensuring that workers' concerns are integrated both in the planning, which is the very important part, but also on the implementation, you know, sort of rather than being treated as sort of an afterthought of, you know, we're going to make sure these jobs are in place. What's been the experience of industrial?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we always said that that works, because we have the experience from other countries, not regarding JETPs, but when we talk about the just transition, the first thing is the social dialogue. That is a very European concept, the social dialogue. But okay, let's leave it in just dialogue. Let's talk. And for the dialogue, we understand as we follow the ILO guidelines for the just transition, and the dialogue for us has to be tripartite, meaning the dialogue between the governments, employers, and workers. Of course, you need to involve as well the communities, other civil society organizations, and so on. But in order to negotiate, you need to bring to the table the governments, the employers, and the workers. And something that we always recommend is to develop structures that could be like round tables or just transition tables in order to have that social dialogue like a permanent something, because this is not something that is going to happen overnight or in 1 month or in 1 year. It's something that it's a process that is going to take some time. So for that, you need to have proper structures to build on that process and to have a permanent dialogue. So this is the way that we understand that this has to be done, because if not, if you don't talk to each other and bringing everyone to the table, this is not going to work.
Yeah, sort of, yeah, a full integration and like any kind of consultation, the regular and systemic consultation and the evolution of that, which can be very difficult. I mean, working on multi-stakeholder anything is like herding cats, right? It takes a lot of time, and it's having that sustained action, and gets also at what Jack was saying about how this is something that really needs to be in place over an extended period of time. But just building on what you said, Diana, to you, Nadia, you know, workers within community, how can community-based organizations establish perhaps effective monitoring systems for JETP? You know, bringing in the local knowledge, bringing in the fact that in the community you have, you know, the workers who are being affected, the need for technical expertise, to sort of hold the government and the financial institutions accountable for the commitments.
Thank you for that question. Well, one approach that we have been using for just transition in Colombia that I think will be used in other countries is based on energy democracy. So the idea behind is that if you set the same, like an equal policy for everyone, in the end, you will end up like giving advantage to those that already have more control of the system or more power in general. So energy policies need to, and the mechanisms behind it, like the JETP or any other in terms of the finance, need to be developed in a way that they recognize these structural differences or injustices and give a special prerogative, special conditions to those that are in a disadvantaged position to participate in the system. So it means in terms, for instance, of finance, well, Jack explained it way better, but you have grants and you have loans. So who is gonna apply for what? And it has to start from a recognition and an analysis of the differences that are already there before setting a policy or a mechanism to approach the population. So it means to taking into account the role of workers, the role of communities that are in the surrounding areas, for instance, of a coal-fired power plant that is closing, and so on. And I think that's an important approach that sounds to be really basic, but when you try to put it in a policy, and I think Shravya will understand that way better because it's her area of work. But that's super challenging. So how do you create a special prerogative when sometimes your whole legal structure doesn't allow you to prioritize someone over other, and so on? So I think that's one of the questions that we have to answer ourselves as a country before starting just setting up different mechanisms and pretending that it will support everyone and all of them will be able to participate, because the reality is that participation is limited by many different factors that sometimes you don't even choose them. So I will recommend that as a key point, to use this justice structure that is also in the paper in terms of distributional justice or procedural justice or recognition and restorative justice into mechanisms that will really deeply approach those that need it the most. And you could approach everyone, but not in the same way. So that will be also my recommendation.
Do you just building on what you were saying, do you see a role for communities to really play a key role in monitoring how those investments are happening? I realize, we're sort of maybe, and maybe I'm mixing apples and oranges here. I mean, this is international financial institutions, so at community level, there's a big range. But what has come out from what everybody has been saying in different contexts is that there are advantages, there are definitely things that the JETP approach brings, but there's also this mismatch. And so how do we build on what we currently have, which is communities, workers, regulatory environment, to ensure that that match is as good a match as possible, and that it's not just a match, but that there's a monitoring to ensure that that match continues. And so is there, and maybe there isn't, I mean, I have no answers. Maybe there isn't a community role, is too fine a level for an international process. But just like with what Diana was saying about workers and workers consistently, systematically being at the table in the decision-making process, is there a similar type of role, perhaps maybe, let's just say from a monitoring perspective? Is that feasible, or is that just, oh, that looks great on paper, but in reality is never going to work?
I think they have a role, but they don't have the whole responsibility. And that's also important to clarify. Like more or less everyone should participate in the monitoring and evaluation of different things that are happening, such as the JETPs, but their role of responsibility on doing this part of the monitoring is different. And the most important is that it's transparent and accessible to everyone. So like I've seen many projects of local environmental monitoring and even epidemiology monitoring from communities to show or litigate, showing that there is that they are being affected by, I don't know, a coal mine or something like that. So the abilities are there. Like people could organize if they have the access to the system and so on. But it doesn't mean that we have to give them the whole work. And therefore, the monitoring, report, and verification system has one part, which is like the one that has the finance, has to provide the information, and then you need mechanisms to prove that or verify that it's properly happening. And then it's important that like the different levels of participants in the whole process could have access to verify what is happening in terms of how it is also involving them, affecting them, and as Diana was saying, like to see how properly are you sharing the benefits, but also the borders behind that. So I will say yes, they could take, and it will be really important that the communities have a role in that, but not the whole heavy
Yes, it's not all
of what is happening. And that also means that developing the monitoring, report, and verification system needs to be created in a way that you give them the access, not only in terms of, yeah, there is a website in English to see what is happening, but the proper tools to understand them and to have agency over it. And there also it's relevant the way you design it to do it.
Yeah.
And
Jack,
hopefully with a active participation of the ones that will take a role on the monitoring.
Yeah. And I just noticed that Jack just dropped in the chat channel a resource that could be sort of a starting point for that. I just want to read out to the panelists a comment that one of the participants said. It was really building on what you, Nadia, and Diana said about industrial development and its importance, and how the energy transition may overlap with a country's development priorities. Overcapacity in carbon-intensive industries, particularly if they are low value added and import intensive, may end up causing a vicious cycle in advancing the economy. Moving towards industries, products, and processes that are less carbon intensive can create opportunities for a less just energy transition. So in conclusion, there a lot more will be needed for justice. And most carbon-intensive industries produce products that are irreplaceable. So that sort of that tension there. Jack, I mean, please, panelists, if you have questions of what your fellow panelists are saying, you know, please jump in. In absence of any of you waving your hands frantically, I'm just going to keep asking questions. Is Jack waving frantically? Go for it, Jack.
Will you allow me to ask a slightly provocative question?
Absolutely.
So we've used the terms workers and community quite a lot. And I'd be interested to understand who are those workers and who are those communities. So are we just focused on coal communities and those that are affected by the coal transition? Or are we also interested in the communities, as Yael has indicated, in industry, in the wider economy that are going to be affected by the transition? Yeah, I'd love to hear the thoughts on, is this focused on coal communities alone, or is there a wider definition of communities and affected workers?
Diana, go for it.
May I? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't need to ask permission. Just turn on your microphones and jump in.
Yeah. Okay. When we talk about workers, is now in this JETP is about energy and energy workers that could be also in the coal, because in South Africa, for example, or in Indonesia, and the countries where the JETPs are mostly focused on coal and on carbon. But we in industrial, when we talk about the just transition, is for I think that it was Laura at the beginning when she introduced me, that she said industry all. It's very important because we represent workers in all the industries and energy, mining, and manufacturing sectors. So meaning that we are looking at the transition of all those sectors. So the JETP is focused on the energy ones, but we are working with all of them. And when we talk about the communities, it's all what it's around the coal mines, for example. And actually now I'm in Colombia, in Bogota, for a seminar, and we are talking a lot about the situation in Colombia and the closure of the mines and so on. And actually yesterday we were saying that, for example, if you are going to close a mine that you have 10,000 workers or 1,000 workers, you around that mine, you have the informal economy of or the tertiarization of the employment, and but also all what it's around the mine, meaning that you have restaurants, you have supermarkets, you have bars, you have a lot of things and people working around that are also surviving thanks to those workers that are in the mine. So when you are going to make a plan, you cannot think only about the 1,000 workers that you have in the mine. You need to think about the informal economy that you have around and all the community that is living thanks to that mine. This is what we mean when we talk about community and workers. So workers could be the key ones that are on the field, and the communities where it's all around that. But you doesn't seem to be very convinced, yeah, with my answer.
Are you convinced, Jack?
It's the exact answer that we've all been talking about for ages, right? And I think it's a very key answer and a very important aspect. In the South African context, coal workers and the workers in and around the coal regions represent less than 0.1% of the 63 million South Africans. At the same time, to be realistic, South Africa is not going to be shutting down our coal mines anytime soon. At least in any time frame that's going to affect the majority of the workers currently employed in that industry. So yes, huge opportunity to perhaps slow the flow of new workers coming into that space. But over the next 20 years, as we slowly phase out coal, a lot of the workers will reach retirement age and retire. But the wider economy, the workers in the industrial sectors and the construction sectors across the board are going to be bearing the cost of this transition. So as we fund thousands of kilometers of new transition lines, as we fund gigawatts of renewable energy, as we fund local manufacturing, all of these costs are being borne by the South African economy as a whole. And I think increasing our definitions of the communities and the workers that are affected by this transition allows us to potentially have a more effective transition in the long run. Rather than keeping a very narrow focus. And I understand that comes with huge risks, but for me, it's kind of one of the reflections that we're seeing here, is how do we broaden that definition to a national definition of South Africa's transition, rather than a specific focus on a single coal region, and just replicating the just transition models that worked in Germany, etc., where that was very much the focus.
Xavier, you sort of, did I see a hand leap up?
Yes, I mean, I don't disagree with any of what's been said, and I think reflecting that there probably are many layers to even this question of, who are the beneficiaries, who's being affected when we talk about community, who's really within that purview. And so on the one hand, I do think that sticking only, and I'm not saying anyone suggested this, but I'm just for, our own clarity, I think broadening the definition and looking at sort of winners and losers at a economy-wide level, at a national economy level over time, I think that is important. I think that is valuable, because that's really ultimately, we look at emissions in the medium to long term, we look at climate impacts in the medium to long term. I think the costs and benefits of an energy transition should also be evaluated in that medium to long term. So I think it is important to look at the economy-wide picture. Yes, there's going to be winners. Yes, there's going to be losers. And some industries are going to shrink. Some industries are going to grow. New jobs are going to be created in some spaces. Some jobs will dwindle. But net is it positive? Is it a beneficial transition? And that is an important lens. I think we just need to make sure that that doesn't come at the exclusion of that little extra attention that does need to be paid to the communities that are being affected in this short to medium term, because otherwise there really is very little different from what distinguishes the just transition or the just energy transition from any other economic or technological or industrial transition that has happened globally or nationally over time. There's always, winners and losers. I think the reason for this framing now is to say, especially in light of that restorative justice pillar, is that for those who are most immediately impacted, is there something additional? Is there something special that can be done to ensure that their livelihoods are protected, or if not their actual livelihoods? Because again, I think we recognize the fallacy in saying renewable jobs will replace coal jobs 1:1 in this specific location. That will not happen. But is there some other way to provide support to enable prosperity And coal was maybe the source of that prosperity, but are there broader socioeconomic initiatives that can kind of come into that place? So just saying that I think there is that macro level, but we should not kind of forget that micro level, because that's where the justice part of this conversation is often located.
So now I have I mean, Jack's nodding and it looked like people were somewhat in agreement, but now I have a question that's maybe slightly provocative or not. How do we get decision makers to take the concept of justice seriously, right? So we've got these great definitions that Laura presented and really sort of teased out. We have examples, South Africa, you know, with their, you know, past history of apartheid and the overlay of justice and what that means. But how do we get decision makers to take this concept of justice as it's been outlined seriously? That this is not a nice add-on, we're being a good government, but that it really is at the heart of this process. I've just stunned everybody into absolute silence. Oh, good, Diana, go for it.
No, I can say that it could be just including everyone and listening to everyone, because everyone I know, but everyone will be impacted in one way or another. So you need to bring all those different groups and listen to them. And
why would I, as a decision maker, what is going to make me internalize and understand the significance of justice in the effective implementation, as opposed to a bunch, I'm going to be very provocative here, a bunch of do-gooders, trade unions, community workers saying it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, because to me, this is where I want to think that if you listen to people, you will understand what is going on behind the scenes and what they will need. So if you get those needs, maybe I hope that you will start making that a just process, is what I want to think.
Jack, you've just put your idea in the chat channel. No, we want to hear it.
And yeah, so this is the point of provocative questions. It's amazing to see the discussion. So thank you so much. And I guess for me, it's changing the definition of justice. Because an over fixation on community well-being, which is massively important, right? So my whole life is around building community development, etc. And I'm saying these things not necessarily because I believe in them, but because I see them as an opportunity to drive the wider space. So if we can change the definition of justice to be around helping countries that are being forced to transition for a global good, to bear the additional costs of that transition, it brings those countries on board. So yes, social safeguards has to be one of the costs that we're going to bear, but we're also going to bear the costs of transmission infrastructure and local manufacturing, industrial development. So if we can expand that definition of justice outside of only social safeguards and include the additional costs that the country has to bear as part of the justice for that country, I think we have a better opportunity of bringing politicians on board, on bringing technocrats on board, on bringing the finance houses on board to really drive this forward. So I think, like, if we get lost in justice only being community safeguards and not covering the additional costs of the whole country, we miss out on an opportunity. So yeah, I just posted that in the chat as well.
Yeah. I'll get to you, Nadia, but I'm just flagging what Ravia put in the chat channel, where she said, I also think we cannot avoid linking this discussion to a more global level, to the existing financial infrastructure and the Bretton Woods institutes, so that it's not just at the national level, but really looking at it at the global level. Nadia.
Yeah, I was thinking of the case of Colombia, because our current government has taken a really active role in pushing forward a just transition. And one of the key points was that they started with a really in-depth diagnosis of what is happening. I mean, what is unjust right now in the energy and mining systems. And they said as a conclusion that one of the main drivers of injustices right now is a development model based on extractivism. And that has been really interesting because after that, many of the policies that came up from that was like no new open coal mining contracts or no new exploration of gas and oil, but also in terms of the alternative, like in the previous government, there was a whole hydrogen roadmap. So for this new government, they were like, yes, hydrogen, but first to meet local needs before being an exported good. So that has been also part of this perspective of what they have also approached as one of the key justice issues that need to be into the discussion. And I think that's deeply linked also to what Rabia was saying, because when you look at things like extractivism, what you look is value change and how a just transition in another country will affect the transition in our country. For instance, Europe is not longer buying the same amount of coal from Colombia as they did before. What are the consequences in our country? Coal mines are closing. So if we are going to start a new strategy, we cannot be in the same dependency situation that we will rely on something that we export, but whenever they buy it or not, then our economy will fluctuate. So this kind of things I think was interesting because was like rooting the problem in something more structural that you can also approach from the perspective of justice, but also the alternative. So what is coming next? Because we so often talk about the transition, but not that much about the future we're planning to build. So what are the the different things that we will do to change what is happening? So, well, I think that was interesting in the case of the country, and also put a lot of the decision makers and policy makers to think a lot on how do I build that? How do I put it in practice? And this is still on a more planning moment than implementation one, but I think it has been interesting in terms of putting it into the discussion nationally and also internationally.
Good, thank you. You know, I'm just looking at the time and I'm being pinged by the organizers. You've only got 4 minutes left. I was going to ask you all to kind of give a summary, but I'm going to change. So as facilitator, I get that prerogative. But before I do that, you know, it's been really interesting hearing this. And I think the point that I mean, I've learned a lot about JETPs by reading Laura's paper, by listening to your experiences, and I think building exactly on what you were just saying. I mean, both what Jack was saying and Nadia was saying about expanding beyond sort of the traditional social safeguards and understanding what the transition means in one country and how it affects another, is the fact that what we need to look at is a systemic change, right? It's not just about a replace of the fossil fuel with the renewables or a low carbon system. It's really about the systemic change and putting people at the center and having, I'm going to say renewables, not low carbon, because that's the perspective I'm coming from, but a renewables-based economy and societies, and how that the development and the implications of that, and how that spreads outwards, and that an energy transition can only be not just by switching from one technology to another, but the ownership and equity as a whole. So we're running out of time. So what I would like to ask you each is just one word that you take from today. It can't be boring, because I hope it hasn't been boring, but it might be something else. You might have learned something, you might not have. So Diana, one word from today.
Yes, sorry. I will just say, put people first.
Put people first. Jack. Oh,
Yeah, I would say collaboration.
Collaboration. Shadia.
Forward looking.
Forward looking. Nadia.
I will keep the first one that I said from the policy brief, the country on transition finance.
Country on transition. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thanks very much to the audience, although we can't see you. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion.